passing note making global headlines at this hour. We have learned this evening that Mikhail Gorbachev has died, the last leader of the Soviet Union who helped end the Cold War and the threat of nuclear war. And we've also learned tonight of his final request.
Before he died, Mikhail Gorbachev revealed the sad truth about the Cold War. The man once praised for pulling the world back from nuclear disaster left behind a final message that turns the old victory story on its head.
Особенно оружие и массовое уничтожение, и ядерное в первую очередь, это колоссальная опасность.
For decades, he stayed silent while the myths grew. But in his last years, he finally told what happened behind closed doors, what peace truly cost, and why it still haunts us today.
Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev made any public pronouncement on the nuclear disaster returnable.
How Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. Mikhail Gorbachev was born in the early 1930s in a small village called Privolnoye in southern Russia. His parents were peasants who worked the land and lived through famine and the losses of the Second World War. As a boy, Mikhail Gorbachev helped his family on the collective farm, driving harvest machines and working long days in the fields. Those early years taught him how hard life was for ordinary people. When he finished school, Mikhail Gorbachev earned a place at Moscow State University to study law, a huge jump for a village boy. In Moscow, he joined the Communist Youth League known as Komsomol, and then the Communist Party itself. He also met Raisa, the woman who would become his wife and closest partner. Friends said that Mikhail Gorbachev liked to argue, to listen, and to ask hard questions without raising his voice, and that he was loyal to the Soviet project but not blind to its faults. After university, the party sent Mikhail Gorbachev back to his home region, Stavropol in the south, a place of farms and small towns. It was not a glamorous job, but it gave him daily contact with workers, engineers, and local officials. Over the next 20 years, he climbed through the local party ranks until he became the top party boss in the region. Mikhail Gorbachev liked to visit factories and fields in person instead of just reading reports. In the 1970s, senior leaders in Moscow started to see Mikhail Gorbachev as one of the few younger officials who might carry the system forward. The head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, took a special interest in him and brought him into higher circles. Mikhail Gorbachev became a member of the party's Central Committee and then joined the Politburo, the small group that made the biggest decisions in the Soviet Union. By the early 1980s, the tiredness of the system was impossible to hide. Under Leonid Brezhnev, the country had fallen into what many called the era of stagnation. Consumer goods were scarce. Families waited in long lines for basic things like meat, butter, and shoes. At the same time, the state was pouring money and lives into the war in Afghanistan and trying to keep up with American weapons programs. Across the ocean, leaders in Washington also noticed that the Soviet Union was struggling. When Mikhail Gorbachev began to speak about reform, openness, and peace, some American officials first thought it was a trick, but his style and openness soon made them wonder if he was different from the men before him. At the very top, power also looked old and weak. After Brezhnev died, Yuri Andropov took power, but he was already sick and ruled for only a short time. Then Konstantin Chernenko followed, even older and even more ill. On television, Soviet citizens watched one funeral after another and quietly wondered if the country itself was dying along with them. Inside the Politburo, senior officials began to accept that they needed someone younger. When Chernenko died in early 1985, they chose Mikhail Gorbachev as the new General Secretary of the Communist Party. At 54 years old, he was the youngest Soviet leader in decades, and the first one born after the Russian Revolution. For ordinary citizens, the change was obvious right away. Mikhail Gorbachev walked among crowds, shook hands, and spoke without reading every word from paper. His wife, Raisa, appeared beside him on trips, something earlier leaders rarely allowed. From the start, Mikhail Gorbachev said that the system had to be rebuilt, not just patched. He first spoke about acceleration, meaning that factories and farms had to work better and more honestly. Very quickly, that word gave way to a bigger one, perestroika, which means restructuring. Under perestroika, the central government in Moscow was supposed to loosen its grip on enterprises. Factory managers were told they would have more freedom to decide what to produce and how to use their budgets, but they would also be responsible for profit and loss. New rules allowed small cooperatives, a kind of legal private business, to open restaurants, repair shops, and services that the state had never provided well. In practice, the reforms of perestroika were messy. Local officials did not want to lose their power. Ministries in Moscow did not want to give up control of money and supplies. Some managers used new freedoms to raise prices or pay themselves more while production stayed poor. Instead of a smooth shift, the country found itself caught between old rules and new ones, and many people felt more confused and more frustrated than before. Alongside perestroika, Mikhail Gorbachev launched another word that would become famous around the world, Glasnost, which means openness. For decades, Soviet citizens had lived with strict censorship. Newspapers hid disasters. History books skipped over mass arrests and famine. Criticizing leaders in public could cost a person their job or their freedom. Glasnost began to loosen that grip. Writers published books that had been banned for years. Films that showed the darker sides of Soviet life were allowed to reach cinemas, and television finally spoke more openly about failures and disasters, such as the Chernobyl nuclear accident. Under Glasnost, well-known government critics like physicist Andrei Sakharov were allowed to return from internal exile, and political prisoners started to be released. Newspapers and television talked more openly about the crimes of the Stalin years and about recent scandals that once would have been covered up. For many people, this felt like fresh air after a lifetime in a closed room. For others, especially older officials, it felt like a threat. If people could speak freely, what else would they start to question? Mikhail Gorbachev and his allies believed that perestroika and glasnost had to go together. Restructuring the economy without telling the truth would not work. But the combination was explosive. As fear eased, ordinary citizens talked more boldly about corruption, waste, and the gap between official slogans and real life. In the Baltic republics, the Caucasus, and other regions, people started to push more openly for local rights and even for independence. Inside the Communist Party, conservative figures such as Yegor Ligachev warned that Mikhail Gorbachev was going too fast and weakening the state. Younger reformers complained that he was still too cautious. By the late 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev was fighting on several fronts at once. He was trying to drag a planned economy into a more flexible shape, trying to open a closed society to honest discussion, and trying to hold together a vast, multi-ethnic state where many groups were no longer afraid to say what they really wanted. He still believed that the Soviet Union could be saved if it became more honest and more humane, but every new step showed him more clearly how badly the old system had been eating away at itself for years. As Mikhail Gorbachev read reports about falling growth, growing shortages, and the rising cost of the arms race, one question kept getting harder to ignore. Even if he could change the way his own country worked, how long could any state survive while spending so much on weapons and so little on its people? That question would push him toward the painful choices that came next. What the Cold War really cost. From the late 1940s onward, the United States and the Soviet Union built up nuclear weapons under a simple but frightening idea. If both sides had enough bombs to wipe each other out, then neither side would dare start a war. Later, this was called mutually assured destruction. By the mid-1980s, the global stockpile of nuclear warheads had climbed to well over 70,000, most of them in American and Soviet hands. That was the highest level the world has ever seen, far above the roughly 12,000 warheads that exist today. Every one of those warheads had a price. It meant more factories, more uranium, more engineers, and more money taken away from normal life. One major study says the United States alone spent around $5.5 to almost $6 trillion on nuclear weapons programs between the 1940s and the mid-1990s, on top of many more trillions for other Cold War forces. For the Soviet Union, Exact figures are harder to pin down, but year after year, Moscow pushed a far bigger share of its economy into the armed forces than Washington did. Some estimates say the Soviet Union was spending around the mid-teens % of its entire economy on the military in the early 1980s. By comparison, American defense spending, even though very large in dollars, took up a clearly smaller share of the U.S. economy. On the ground, this gap showed up in daily life. In the Soviet Union, tanks and missiles rolled out of factories while shoppers stood in long lines for basic food and household goods. Stores ran short of meat and sugar even as new warheads were slid into underground silos. In the United States, the malls, highways, and full supermarkets could make life look comfortable. But even there, people argued about why there always seemed to be money for new bombers and not enough for schools, housing, or health care. Fear did not just live in official numbers. It moved into homes, classrooms, and city streets. In the United States, children grew up with duck and cover drills, hiding under school desks, while films like Duck and Cover with Bert the Turtle told them to drop to the floor and shield their heads if they ever saw a bright flash. Civil defense offices printed booklets on how to build a fallout shelter, and many families dug concrete bunkers in basements and backyards and stocked them with food and water just in case sirens sounded for real. On the Soviet side, the fear looked different but felt just as heavy. State media warned again and again that hostile forces were trying to encircle the country. Civil defense plans called for mass evacuation of cities, while deep underground command posts near Moscow were prepared so top leaders could survive a nuclear strike. Real information about accidents and disasters was often hidden, so people might only hear short, vague statements on the radio. The message that did get through was simple. The outside world was dangerous, and the country had to stay armed and ready. The scariest part is that for decades the system almost failed more than once. Long before Mikhail Gorbachev took power, there were moments when a misunderstanding or a broken sensor could have ended everything. In October of 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union spent almost 2 weeks facing off over Soviet missiles in Cuba, and later both sides admitted they had come close to a nuclear exchange. In the early 1980s, Soviet leaders grew so nervous about a possible surprise attack that they watched NATO exercises with deep suspicion, including a large exercise in 1983 that made them fear those drills might hide a real strike. That same year, a Soviet early warning center reported what looked like incoming American missiles. The duty officer, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, decided it was a computer error and chose not to report it as a real attack. Later checks proved he was right, but if he had followed the manual, the incident could have pushed both sides far closer to disaster. By the time Gorbachev saw the classified reports in the mid-1980s, he understood that the planet had been living on luck as much as on policy. On one side of his desk, there were numbers showing how much of the Soviet budget vanished into weapons. On the other side, there were records of near misses, war scares, and secret drills. For him, the arms race was no longer some distant contest between systems. It felt like a narrow path running along the edge of a cliff. As he developed what he later called new political thinking, Mikhail Gorbachev began to describe the nuclear arms race as a race toward a shared abyss, even as a form of common suicide. In speeches and essays, he argued that security in a nuclear age could not be one-sided. If either superpower tried to gain absolute military superiority, both would end up less safe, because the other side would only answer with more fear and more weapons. He said that the only safety worth having was common security, where each side accepted that the other had a right to exist and to feel safe too. Part of the problem, in Gorbachev's view, was that the Cold War had turned into a self-feeding machine. In the United States, President Dwight Eisenhower had already warned about a military-industrial complex, a web of arms makers, generals, and lawmakers who had a strong interest in keeping defense budgets high. In the Soviet Union, there was a similar pattern. Whole industrial towns, research centers, and design bureaus existed mainly to serve the military, and many scientists, factory bosses, and security officials built their careers on the assumption that the confrontation with the West would last forever. If the arms race slowed down, their budgets and their influence would shrink. When Gorbachev raised the idea of cutting spending, some of his own generals warned that any move in that direction would look like weakness. Yet the more Mikhail Gorbachev thought about it, the more he became convinced that the real risk lay in staying on the same road. The Cold War had twisted economies, fed propaganda, and trained two whole societies to see each other as enemies first and human beings second. There were already enough nuclear warheads in the world to destroy modern civilization many times over. For Gorbachev, the logic was simple. Nobody could win this kind of contest. At best, everyone might survive it by refusing to let it go any further. So he began to say that nuclear war could never be a normal part of politics. It could only be the end of politics. If the superpowers kept treating the arms race like a test of pride, they would eventually run out of luck. The only real way forward, in his mind, was to reverse the logic that had ruled the Cold War for decades and try to build trust where there had only been fear. But that choice could not be made on paper alone. It had to be made face-to-face with the very people who had built their careers on hard lines and tough talk. Once Mikhail Gorbachev accepted that the arms race was a dead end, his next step was almost unthinkable for a Soviet leader. He had to look his main rival in the eye and find out if the man who called his country an evil empire was just as tired of living on the edge. Talking the world back from the edge. In November of 1985, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev met for the first time in Geneva, Switzerland. Reagan arrived as the tough anti-communist leader backed by a huge military buildup. Gorbachev arrived as the younger Soviet reformer, trying to pull his country back from the edge without looking weak. Their advisors were nervous. Many people around Reagan thought Mikhail Gorbachev would try to trick the West with friendly words while keeping Soviet power exactly the same. Many people around Gorbachev thought Reagan would only lecture and threaten. But once the doors closed, the tone changed. The two leaders spent hours talking about the one thing they both feared most: a nuclear war nobody could stop once it started. At Geneva, they made a simple joint statement that sounded almost obvious, but was actually huge. Together, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev said that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. For the first time, both superpowers publicly agreed that their weapons were not tools for victory, but tools that, if used, would destroy everyone. Less than a year later, in October of 1986, the two men met again in a small, windy capital, Reykjavik, in Iceland. There were no big crowds and no grand stage. Inside a plain white house, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan argued almost non-stop for 2 days. They went far beyond what anyone expected. At one point, they even talked about wiping out all their nuclear missiles over time. The main obstacle was a U.S. project called the Strategic Defense Initiative, often nicknamed Star Wars, which was a plan for a space-based missile defense system. Gorbachev wanted strict limits on it. Reagan refused. In the end, they walked out of Reykjavik without a deal. Many people called the summit a failure. But for Mikhail Gorbachev, it proved something important. Even the hardline American president could be pushed to imagine a world with far fewer nuclear weapons. That idea would not go away. The real breakthrough came the next year. In December of 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev went to Washington, D.C., to sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, usually called the INF Treaty. This was not just a promise to freeze their missile count. It was the first agreement that actually ordered an entire class of land-based missiles to be destroyed. The treaty covered missiles with ranges of roughly 300 to about 3,400 miles. Under its rules, the two sides agreed to scrap a total of 2,692 missiles and to accept on-site inspections, where inspectors from the other side could visit bases and actually watch weapons being cut up. For the Cold War, this was almost unthinkable. Mikhail Gorbachev was letting Americans walk around Soviet missile sites because he believed real trust had to be checked, not just claimed. Pictures of Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev smiling and signing the treaty in the White House went around the world. In Western countries, people celebrated Gorbachev as the Soviet leader who was finally willing to choose arms cuts over arms races. In his own country, the reaction was much colder. Some Soviet generals and party bosses said Mikhail Gorbachev had given away hard-won strength for nothing but applause. To them, pulling missiles out of Europe looked like surrender, not strategy. While the missiles were being removed, Mikhail Gorbachev was also changing something much bigger, the way Moscow treated its neighboring communist states in Eastern Europe. Since the 1960s, the unwritten rule had been simple. If a country like Czechoslovakia or Poland tried to move away from strict Soviet-style rule, Soviet tanks would roll in. This approach was known in the West as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Mikhail Gorbachev quietly walked away from that rule. In 1989, one of his spokesmen jokingly called the new approach the Sinatra Doctrine, after the song My Way. The message was that countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany could now do it their way, without expecting Soviet troops to crush them. When Polish voters supported the opposition movement Solidarity in semi-free elections, Mikhail Gorbachev did not send tanks. When crowds filled the streets in East Germany, demanding change, he still held back. That choice changed history. With no Soviet army moving in, protests in Eastern Europe turned into peaceful revolutions. Governments that had seemed frozen for decades toppled in a matter of months. On November 9, 1989, crowds in Berlin smashed and climbed over the Berlin Wall, the concrete border that had cut the city in two since the early 1960s. Suddenly, the Cold War's most famous symbol was being torn apart by ordinary people with hammers and bare hands. Mikhail Gorbachev did not plan the fall of that wall, but his decision not to send in troops made it possible. He accepted a united Germany, even though it meant one large, powerful country tied to the Western military alliance. In return, the West promised that the new Germany would not host nuclear weapons on its territory, and that the pullout of Soviet forces would be handled in an orderly way. While Eastern Europe was changing, Gorbachev was also speaking directly to the wider world. In December of 1988, he stood before the United Nations in New York and announced major cuts to Soviet conventional forces in Europe. He talked about a common European home, a future where security was based on cooperation instead of fear and tight military blocs. For many viewers, it was shocking to see a Soviet leader calling for less force and more trust. The next year, in December of 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev met the new American president, George H.W. Bush, on ships off the island of Malta in the Mediterranean Sea. The seas were rough, and at one point the rain was so heavy that leaders had to rush between cabins. But inside, the message was calm. Bush and Gorbachev both said that the Cold War confrontation was coming to an end. Many people later called Malta the meeting where the Cold War was finally declared over. The work did not stop there. German reunification had to be settled. Mikhail Gorbachev agreed that East and West Germany could become one country, join the Western Alliance, and still be a partner to Moscow. Soviet troops would pull back, and Germany would not host nuclear weapons. It was another step that cut Soviet military reach, but fit Gorbachev's belief that lasting peace was more valuable than keeping an empire by force. In 1990, Gorbachev received the Nobel Peace Prize for his leading role in easing East-West tensions and allowing Eastern Europe to change without a major war. People in many countries saw him as the man who had ended the Cold War without a shot between the superpowers. In July of 1991, he and President Bush signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, known as START 1, in Moscow. This treaty went even further than the INF deal. It set firm limits on long-range nuclear weapons. Once the cuts were finished, each side could have no more than about 6,000 warheads, carried on no more than about 1,600 missiles and bombers. Inside the Soviet Union, life felt very different. The economy was in trouble. Prices were rising. Many store shelves were bare. New freedoms also brought loud criticism. Nationalist movements in places like the Baltic states, Georgia, and Ukraine pushed hard for more power or full independence. Hardline communists and security chiefs were angry about the loss of control in Eastern Europe and the pullback of troops. To them, Mikhail Gorbachev had gone too far, too fast. In August of 1991, that anger exploded into a desperate move. A group of senior officials, including the vice president, top generals, and the head of the KGB, formed a state committee on the state of emergency and tried to push Mikhail Gorbachev aside. They flew to his holiday house in Crimea, cut his phone lines, and demanded that he sign papers handing over power. Gorbachev refused. The plotters declared that he was ill and tried to take control in Moscow. The coup failed within days. Crowds in Moscow gathered around the Russian parliament building. Boris Yeltsin, the elected president of the Russian Republic, stood on a tank and called on people to resist. Units of the army refused to fire on civilians. When Mikhail Gorbachev flew back to Moscow, the coup leaders were already collapsing. But the damage to the Soviet system was fatal. The failed coup stripped the old Communist Party of much of its remaining authority and pushed the Union toward its end. By December of 1991, one Soviet republic after another had declared independence. On December 25th, Mikhail Gorbachev went on television and announced that he was stepping down as president of the Soviet Union. That same evening, the red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time and replaced with the Russian tricolor. One superpower disappeared in a single winter night. By the time he left the Kremlin, the Cold War was over. The Soviet Union was gone, and a new story was already spreading across the world. A story that said America had won and Mikhail Gorbachev had lost. He would spend the rest of his life quietly arguing that the truth was not that simple. Gorbachev's final truth about the Cold War. After Mikhail Gorbachev left the Kremlin, his life split into two very different directions. In the West, many people saw him as the man who had helped end the Cold War without a world war. He spoke in parliaments, gave lectures, and was treated as a kind of elder statesman for peace. In Russia, a lot of people saw something else. The leader under whom the Soviet Union broke apart. Prices went wild, and many families felt their lives fall apart. That contrast only grew over time. Russian opinion polls often showed Mikhail Gorbachev near the bottom of the trust list, far below newer leaders. Many blamed him for losing superpower status and for the rough years that followed the Soviet collapse. At the same time, Mikhail Gorbachev's daily life changed in quiet but telling ways. He set up the Gorbachev Foundation in Moscow to study global problems and support his ideas about democracy and cooperation. Money was tight, so in the late 1990s, he even agreed to appear in a Pizza Hut commercial filmed in Moscow's Red Square. In that ad, a family argues about his legacy while sharing a slice of pizza. The fee, reported to be close to $1 million, went toward supporting his foundation's work. That image of a former Soviet president in a fast food commercial became a symbol of how completely his world had turned upside down. Through all of this, Mikhail Gorbachev kept explaining what the Cold War had really meant to him. In his Nobel Peace Prize lecture in 1990, and in later books and essays, he described the Cold War as a long clash between two systems that nearly ruined both sides. To him, it was not a noble contest that one side won, but a dangerous standoff that pushed the whole planet toward disaster. He said that his reforms, like perestroika and glasnost, were meant to give socialism a human face and open the Soviet Union up, not to surrender to Washington. That view came out very clearly in an interview he gave in the summer of 2004, soon after Ronald Reagan's funeral. When a reporter asked if Reagan had won the Cold War, Mikhail Gorbachev pushed back. He said the idea that one side had won was not serious. Then he said the line that would follow him for the rest of his life. "I think we all lost the Cold War, particularly the Soviet Union. "We each lost about $10 trillion, he added, talking about the money both sides had poured into weapons over 4 tense decades. When Mikhail Gorbachev said, "we all lost," he was not just talking about money. He meant schools that were never built, hospitals that were never repaired, homes that stayed cold in winter because resources went into rockets and bombs. He meant the years of fear, the lies in the media, and the feeling that ordinary people were just pieces on a board they did not control. In his speeches, he said that the real success of his time in power was not the fall of any flag, but the simple fact that the nuclear standoff ended without the world burning. What hurt Mikhail Gorbachev was how quickly that feeling was buried under victory stories. He had dreamed of a common European home, a continent where East and West would share security instead of facing each other as enemies. Instead, he watched as one side celebrated and treated the other as if it had just lost a final match. In later years, in his book The New Russia and in essays from his foundation, he wrote that Western leaders acted as if they could reshape Europe alone once the Soviet Union was gone. That, he believed, was a missed chance to build a stable order with Russia at the table as an equal partner. By the middle of the 2010s, Mikhail Gorbachev's warnings grew darker. During the crisis over Ukraine in 2014, he said openly that the world was on the brink of a new Cold War. In 2019, as old arms control treaties fell apart, he told reporters that the world was in colossal danger from nuclear weapons and urged leaders to return to talks. The United States and Russia had already withdrawn from major agreements like the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Newer weapons, including hypersonic missiles, were being tested. Officials on both sides openly said that the thick network of past arms control deals had almost completely fallen apart. Mikhail Gorbachev did not pretend he had done everything right. In his Nobel lecture and in later reflections, he said he had underestimated how hard it would be to change a system that had been built on fear and control for so long. He spoke about perestroika as an unfinished process and admitted that he and his team did not foresee how sharply living standards would fall for many people or how quickly anger and nationalism would rise in different republics. But he also said that the other path, using force to hold the old Union together, would have meant a civil war on a massive scale, something he was never willing to risk. He also felt the personal cost very clearly. Mikhail Gorbachev knew that millions at home blamed him for lost savings and lost pride, even as millions abroad thanked him for stepping back from nuclear confrontation. In interviews late in life, he said simple things like, "I did what I thought was right. That is all a man can do." For him, opening up the country, allowing free speech, and stepping away from violence were choices that still mattered, even if they left him almost alone in his own land. When he died in August 2022, his last chapter matched the split he had lived with for so many years. Foreign leaders spoke warmly of Mikhail Gorbachev as a visionary who had helped end the Cold War. In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin sent a short message of condolence but did not attend the funeral. Gorbachev's body lay in state in the House of the Unions, under the high ceiling where past Soviet leaders had once been honored. But this time there was no full state funeral. He was buried at Novodevichy Cemetery next to his wife Raisa, the partner who had walked with him through every crisis. A modest crowd came to say goodbye, many of them older Russians who still remembered the hope and fear of those years. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.